Welcome to another episode of PG Radio. On this episode of my podcast, I'm here with Professor Joseph LeDoux. And I have an entire intro written out for you because there was so much for me to process and then just digest and paraphrase by myself. But Joseph LeDoux is an American neuroscientist whose research is primarily focused on survival circuits, including their impacts on emotions such as fear and anxiety. Please correct me wherever I'm wrong. LeDoux is the world's foremost authority in the neurobiology of anxiety and fear. Writing in New York Magazine, neuroscience reporter Casey Schwartz said, "If this is the age of anxiety, LeDoux is our Lewis and our Clark." LeDoux is the Henry and Lucy Moses Professor of Science at New York University and the director of the Emotional Brain Institute, a collaboration between NYU and the New York State. He's the author of many books, including The Emotional Brain and the Synaptic Self. In addition to numerous scholarly articles that he's written, his many honors include the Fyssen International Prize in Cognitive Science, the American Psychological Association's Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award, and the William James Award for the Association for Psychological Science. In 2013, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. He is also the lead singer and songwriter in the band The Amygdaloids. Did I get all that right?
That's right.
Tell me about, we picked up the conversation about music. Tell me about that. How is it that you were interested in music?
I grew up in Louisiana, and music and food are the biggest things down there. When I wasn't that interested in the Louisiana music, though.
Right.
The Cajun music, because it seemed like old man music at the time. Now I love it, of course, but like the folk scene had hit, and everybody had an acoustic guitar, and then the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan. Everybody got electric guitars, and so we formed a band. We started trying to play Beatles music, but we weren't good enough, so we played Rolling Stones, and
You were good enough for Rolling Stones?
Yeah, good enough for Rolling Stones.
Have you seen this Vox Netflix documentary on Netflix called Explained? Have you bumped across that?
Explained?
Explained, yes. I think they've really upped the game in terms of explaining information. They've really compressed information in 20 minutes bit with truly using graphic interfaces to go about. And they had an episode on music, and that sort of made me wonder for the first time, how much do we really know about the neuroscience of music?
It's funny. People ask me about that a lot, but it's a field I got my own thing in research, and I like music, and I integrate the music with my science and stuff. But I don't feel like I'm an expert on the neuroscience of music. But I did go to a conference once called the Metacognition Society, and it was in Nashville. And so we got to play at the conference as part of my lecture. They asked me to do a little performance, and I got to do that, and then had a gig in Nashville afterwards. And last month I was in Milan at the airport waiting for my flight, and the guy walks up to me and said, "Are you a neuroscientist?" I said, "Yes." "How'd you know that?" He said, "I saw you playing guitar in Nashville." So that was the greatest comment ever. Had.
Oh wow! So that's not that you say is not part of your research. That's something that you would not be an expert in.
That's right. Yeah. But there's quite a bit of work going on about it, and people like Dan Levitin wrote a book, "This Is Your Brain on Music," and so it's quite a large field now.
Yeah, because it's kind of interesting. I wonder why something like music would evolve. Right, like from an evolution.
There are a lot of ideas about that. Unfortunately, I don't have any.
Right. Because I there was just like a tangent I wanted to pick on too. Because I think I was dancing at some music the other day, and I was like, what comprehension is to speech, what the process of decoding and comprehension is to the process of speech, which is encoding. Dancing is to music, and that's kind of weird because dancing is also a cross-cultural phenomenon we have barely any understanding about. On the issues of emotion, I think you started the Joe Rogan podcast as well on how your research has been sort of miscarried. Your research on fear. What is really happening there? What
misguided or mischaracterized?
Mischaracterized. Yes.
I've worked on fear for a long time, behaviors that we associate with fear for a long time. Maybe I should start first by saying, as a PhD student working with Mike Zaniga, I studied consciousness in split brain patients. And got interested in kind of emotional consciousness through some study we did at that time. And we basically what we were doing, we were studying how the brain, how the left hemisphere of the brain in a split brain patient, this is someone whose two sides of the brain have been cut in half to control epilepsy.
Right.
So the left side you can talk to because that's where language is. The right side is nonverbal, but you can elicit behaviors from it. So we would elicit a bunch of behaviors like make the person stand up, and you say, why'd you do that? Now we're talking to the left hemisphere, but it was the right hemisphere that made the person stand up because of the command we put over there.
Right.
And so I needed to stretch. Or if you made him laugh, you go, ha-ha, you say, why'd you do that? You guys are funny.
Right.
So it was just he was generating stories, narratives to explain his behavior. And I think it's, the idea we came up with at the time was that we all have this sense of free will and that we're in charge of our behavior. And it's disturbing. It induces kind of a cognitive dissonance when you find yourself behaving for meaningful ways that you didn't tell yourself to do.
Right.
So one thing consciousness may do is try to, keep it all together by telling a tale about why you did what you did. And so we were doing these experiments on putting emotional stimuli in the right emotion. The details are not important, but I got interested in the topic of emotion. And from the very beginning, I thought of emotions as interpretations of why we do what we do. So then I decided, there weren't any good methods to study the human brain back then in terms of detail, no fMRI or anything like that. So I said, well, what can I do? I said, I'm going to study how the brain produces these emotional responses that we ultimately interpret. And I'm going to do it in rats because it's easier to do.
Right.
But I was not studying emotional consciousness. I wasn't studying the experience of emotion, fear. I was studying how the brain behaviorally responds and physiologically responds to the danger stimulus you present.
Right.
And so all these years I was doing that, and I wasn't that clear with the language because I didn't really understand what I was, where I was headed. But it always bothered me that the field was called fear conditioning, which is the field I was working in, because I didn't think it was really fear. It was more kind of the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that I found was important for all this. And other people found it too, so it's not just me. But that became a fear center. But it was, I said, well, if it's going to be a fear center, we should call it an implicit or an unconscious fear center, because it's not where the feeling of fear comes from.
Right.
But that never had any traction in the world. People just, it was too easy to say it's a fear center, and people like the lay public, journalists, and so forth, didn't really get the difference. And the scientists really didn't want to get the difference because we get a lot of money for studying, doing research that is going to solve the problems of fear and anxiety. By studying rats, which I don't think we're going to do. We can talk about that in a minute. But I kept saying, well, this is wrong. We shouldn't be talking this way. And again, I wasn't always that clear. But at some point, it just got to the point where I said, no, we got to straighten this out.
Right.
And so in 2012, I wrote a paper in the journal called Neuron. The paper was called Rethinking the Emotional Brain. And it was about, emotions are experiences. We feel an emotion. If we don't feel it, it's not a feeling.
Right.
So it's got to be conscious. So we shouldn't be using mental state terms for things that aren't mental states. And that has caused a tremendous amount of confusion. So people, like pharmaceutical companies, are going to solve our problems of fear and anxiety by measuring whether a rat is more timid or not in a challenging situation when the animal has a certain drug. So what you find is that the rat spends more time in the presence of danger when it has the drug, so he's less timid. So when you give the drug to a person, they should be less fearful, because it's assumed that fear is why the rat is less less timid.
Right.
But all we know behaviorally from the rat is he's less timid. But we project our emotions onto other people, onto other animals, we watch video games and we project our emotions onto,
There's some
icons.
sort of instinct, right.
We're anthropomorphic by nature. It's been said that the human brain is innately anthropomorphic because it was useful to our, early human ancestors to treat animals like people. They lived, the barn and the house were the same thing. They lived together. They were using animals in agriculture, and it was just part of life. And so it was useful to have this kind of one-on-one relationship with the animals.
Right.
Not that it was always two-sided. I mean, the humans probably beat the heck out of these animals to make them do what they wanted.
Right.
But, it was it was kind of, you assume that they had these feelings and emotions, and if you beat him, he's going to obey you because he's afraid of you.
Right.
In fact, Darwin said, well, we know that the dogs may have a sense of religion, a kind of religion, because they view their masters as these powerful agents like God.
That's a very interesting notion.
Yeah. So Darwin was a terrible anthropomorphist. He loved dogs, and he lived in a society in Victorian England when anthropomorphism was really wildly rampant. So the novel Black Beauty was the most important novel of his time. It was about a horse that was mistreated by humans, and it's all told from the narration point of the horse.
Right.
And so Darwin was asked, well, why when you talk about emotions, you talk about animals having human emotions, but for everything else you talk about humans having animal body parts? They switch the direction.
Right, they switch the direction, right.
And he said, well, it's kinder and the public will accept it more.
So for PR purposes.
He was afraid that if he talked about emotions as humans having animal emotions, then it would make us, it would be harder for the public to get behind it.
Right.
And would distract from his theory.
He was sort of also collapsing the hierarchy of being in some sense with his theory of evolution, right? And so doing that in the opposite sake, that we have distinct emotions, would sort of go against his motion as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Because he was trying to like build it all up, but rather than sending it back down.
Right.
I mean, he just made an assumption that he said that emotions are mental states we've inherited from ancestors. And how do you inherit a mental state? Well, that has to be through the brain. And he kind of, he admitted that it has something to do with the nervous system. But, what is a mental state? A mental state is an awareness that you're in some kind of situation. So for me, an emotion is the awareness that you, with capital U, Y-O-U, capital letters, is involved. If the snake's not going to bite you, you're not afraid of it. You have to be part of the experience.
Right.
When you're in love, it's you that's in love. It's not this body or this kind of abstract thing. It's you.
The subject.
You are the subject. It's not just an object. You're not just it's not the self as an object.
It's the self as a subject. Right.
And it's at the same time we've got all these behavioral and physiological responses that go with love and go with fear. And all these things. But those are not the emotion. Those, because they kind of are so entwined, they often go together in parallel, right? That we think that it's all coming out of the same system. That an area like the amygdala is both making fear and producing the responses, because it's the fear that makes the responses. So the amygdala experiences fear, and the fear in the amygdala drives the responses. But there's lots of reasons to be suspicious about that kind of view. For example, subliminal stimulation studies. That means I flash a stimulus to your eyes very quickly, like a snake, and it goes into your brain. If you put you in a magnet when we're doing that, and image your brain to get some pictures of what's going on, you see that the amygdala is activated in the presence of the snake picture. But because you've presented it very quickly and masked it with white noise afterwards, so that you don't really attend to it that much, you don't know that the stimulus was there. You can't report that you saw anything, and you certainly don't feel fear. So fear is not what causes these responses. The responses are caused separately from the fear. Fear is what happens when you consciously are aware that all that is happening to you.
Right. So, just to clarify that distinction, you clarified by saying that the amygdala is responsible for threat detection, and therefore all these physiological responses sort of happen from there.
Yeah.
The fear is almost like a conscious linguistic or non-linguistic processing of this threat. Am I correct in understanding that?
Well, so it's a cognitive, I think it's the gathering of cognitive information about the situation in which you find yourself.
Right.
And so let's just kind of walk through what happens. So there's a snake.
Right.
That goes into your brain, pretty quickly gets to the amygdala and starts generating body responses. You're freezing, your heart is beating fast, your palms are sweating. It's also traveling to, it takes a little longer, but it gets to your memory system. So you're now retrieving memories about snakes. Because you see a snake, so You know that snakes are reptiles, so kind of like a semantic memory about what's there. But also episodic memories, any experiences you've had with snakes become relevant. But these stimuli are also triggering a different kind of memory, which is a kind of conceptual or schematic memory. So every experience in life you've had about danger has been stored in your brain in some way, and you've accumulated a set of body of knowledge about what danger is, about how people respond in dangerous situations, how you typically respond in dangerous situations. Are you a brave person, a shy person, a timid person? You know, does your heart beat fast, or do you just ignore it? Do your palms really sweat? Is it embarrassing because your underarms are getting wet and your head is sweating? So you know all this stuff. You have this information. So when you see a dangerous stimulus, it kind of pattern completes the schema. You know, some subset of all of the stuff you know about danger that is activated and becomes a kind of non-conscious template that some of which can be directed by attention into conscious awareness.
Right.
And that is your experience of fear.
So this consistency that sort of appears in the narrative, which you speak of in the sense of like or this unconscious template that rises up, the fact that am I a shy person, am I a bold, do you think that's like a primary priority that our consciousness has in terms of, is the preservation of consistency a priority that my consciousness has?
Yes, I would think so.
Because I recently got into trouble in one of my psychology class at Columbia because I said I don't trust motivated verbal reports at all. If somebody's to ask me a question about myself in an experiment, I don't trust the response, even myself. Because
so if you're asking, you know, did you see a red dot on the screen? You probably trust yourself to
right.
But not about, you know,
Are
how
you
many
happy right
times did you have sex this week? You know?
Right. Or even like, are you bold as a person? I'm so caught up in preserving myself.
Exactly. Yeah. No. It's you know. So verbal report is our best window into consciousness, but it's certainly not a magic bullet because you know when you try to get at the juicy stuff, people are not going to tell you the truth. So, but you know, for better or worse, I mean, if you know, it really depends on the situation, and it's. I think that you know we have to use it because otherwise we can't drive the wedge between what's conscious and what's not.
True.
So in a human, we can, you know, we can talk about things that we're conscious of, but we can't talk about stuff we're not conscious of. On the other hand, we can respond non-verbally to stuff we're conscious of and non-conscious of. So I can, you know, non-verbally my heart can beat faster to a stimulus, but I can't consciously tell my heart to beat faster, but I can point to a stimulus, you know.
Right.
Non-verbally, even I can, a stimulus that I'm conscious of, I can say, well, I see that. You know,
Right.
But if I'm not conscious of it, I can't say I see it, or I can't, you know, intentionally point to it. The problem is that in animals, all we have is the nonverbal response.
Right.
So there's no second response system to say, well, this is a good mark of consciousness and this is not. And that's why it's so hard to scientifically say that we know what's on an animal's mind, because you can always design an experiment that will give you an alternative explanation about why the animal responded
that way,
that
a particular way. Yeah.
It's, you know, fear is causing the response, but you can come up with some kind of
a different story
that doesn't require the conscious explanation.
Right.
And without the verbal report, you just don't have that extra edge to overcome that.
I often bump across, I don't know how to frame it, but it seems like the ability to speak, the ability to communicate, and consciousness are almost inseparably tied to each other.
They're definitely closely related, and it's I don't want to tie consciousness and emotion too much to words.
Right.
I think that they're important, but so let's say actually came up today. I was talking with having an email correspondence with a colleague. So for me, danger is what's universal. Fear is not universal. Every culture has to deal with danger in some way. And every animal has to deal with danger. But if you're a human, where are you from?
From India, New Delhi, India.
So in India, you have a certain way of dealing with danger.
Right.
Maybe it's not the same as in New York, quite exactly. So culturally, you have a difference. Now, in addition to that, because of the fear schema in your brain, you have a different fear schema than your sister or brother that you grew up with in India, and your parents, and everybody else.
Right.
It's your fear schema is yours. Now that is defined by the culture in which you live, and that makes it different from others. So part of the problem, I think, in people in the world getting along is we can translate our words across languages to some extent. And so we think when we say fear, we all mean the same thing, but we don't.
Right.
And that's almost a trivial example, because in politics, the words that you think you're talking about the same thing and you're not, and then the treaty falls apart.
Right. Huh. So, what would be your guess along the lines of language and consciousness? What predates what? Would you say emotion and consciousness predates language, or?
So, my most recent book is called The Deep History of Ourselves, the 4 billion year story of how we got conscious brains. And in it, I make a kind of, I would say, relatively radical suggestion that emotions are human, what we call emotions, what humans call emotions, are particular to our species, and that they depend on certain processes, cognitive processes, that are also particular to our species. So in other words, emotions didn't arise through natural selection. They are what Stephen Jay Gould called exaptations, something that arises for some other reason and then gets used
for something else,
for a different reason.
Right.
And one of his examples was the feathers arose in reptiles as a source of warmth, but then they became useful because they were light. They could be used in flying.
Right.
So one acceptation that I think was important was language, and not because it necessarily provided words, but because of syntax and the ability to support hierarchical reasoning across categories, both laterally and horizontally.
Right.
And with this, an animal, in most cases, has to learn through trial and error. Like you've got 3 rats around. If the rat is going to figure out who's nice and who's not, he's got to go through some kind of experience. You can't use hearsay and rumor and conversation to. They can't gossip about each other. So, that's one important theory about human behavior. Right. Gossip. Gossip. Very important.
Very important in the evolutionary data. Yes.
Because stuff happens out in the savannah when you've been hunting for
days,
whatever,
for years, months. Yeah.
And then you come back and you say, well, Sam was really chicken out there. Don't depend on him when sitting around the campfire later. Don't depend on Sam because he's not going to support you.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Is that an implication that the Chomskyan view on the evolution of grammar? It's basically hierarchical reasoning that was evolved and then it was accepted.
Yeah, I don't want to I don't know enough about linguistics.
Sure. I'm just making you take a guess. I'm just saying.
But I think that what I'm talking about is this this ability to use reasoning across categories. And one important thing about that is that it's not that it's about words, right? It's about what language does to the wiring of our cortex.
Right.
It changes our ability to have cognition, and it makes it a new kind of cognition available to us.
A metacognition in some sense.
Yeah, certainly the ability to have metacognition beyond visual metacognition, which an animal could have, or auditory metacognition. It's about being able to do it in an abstract, conceptual way.
Yeah, because I've been almost I have a professor, and she's an expert on metacognition, and we've been sitting through this
Janet
class.
Metcalf?
No, her name's Lisa Son.
Okay.
And we've been just butting heads talking about metacognition. And it seems like it's so difficult if you employ language to talk about metacognition because you've already entered the territory of metacognition. Just the discernment becomes so difficult at that point. But one of the more interesting things that I picked up from your interview with Rogan and then from your book was also your mention about the autonomatic quality, this mental time travel. I can be in the past, present, and it is kind of amazing if you think about it, right? Like we can stimulate time travel in our head, but why? I don't understand purely from a Darwinian standpoint. Why would we evolve for something like that?
Why would we evolve for something? Well, I mean, it's obviously useful to. So, you know, an animal that can put itself into personal past situations, again, kind of has that social advantage because it's not just about you remember what happened, you remember who did what, and you know you have kind of a theory of mind about what they were doing back then.
Right.
So, you know, it's been very difficult to do two things in animal studies. People have really tried hard. One is to demonstrate theory of mind in animals, and the other is to demonstrate mental time travel. And they're both, they're kind of interrelated. Their ability to put yourself into a different position, different kind of mental set. And neither one of those has been, you know, there's always, again, because of the nonverbal nature of animal cognition, there's always an alternative explanation for why they did what they did. So it's complicated. So, you know, I'm often accused of denying animal consciousness. That's not true. I just don't think it's a good scientific question because it's just so complicated, and there's no way to come up with a foolproof experiment to nail it. As far as I think, I mean that's my opinion so far, anyway. But I don't deny that animals have experiences. It's just, you know, I go home, I pet my cat, he purrs, I think he's happy. We get along fine. You know, again, it's like this innate anthropomorphism that we have. It's just, you don't have to be a scientist every moment of the day.
Right.
You know, I mean, you treat your spouse, your girlfriend, or whatever, whoever you're living with, in some kind of way that is not scientific. You know, and you treat your pets in a non-scientific way.
Right.
But when you're in the lab asking scientific questions, you've got to put a different hat on.
Right. You cannot be testing for falsifiability with your spouse all the time. That must be very annoying. But it's just always like when I was reading about the pneumatic aspect of consciousness and the autonomic aspect, I was like, that seems like extremely strong social pressures. The need to remain together, the need to that would create something of that sort.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I really liked was how, like, it was like a paradigm shift for me in terms of understanding consciousness. I've been very fascinated by the subject since I sat through a Buddhist meditation retreat over the summer, and it's a 10-day silent retreat. You basically shut up, you take stimulus off of your system, and you observe yourself. And I always thought of consciousness as like a torchlight that's illuminating whatever iceberg tip of my cognition is. But you seem to sort of, within that paradigm, sort of inverted it. You built up, bottom up, in the sense of what an experience is, right? Do you have something to say about? Do you have something to say about how I have perceived consciousness? How is it different from the way you have sort of mentioned?
Well, I'm not. Maybe what. Let me try to answer what I think you said, which is that what are the elements that are being built up?
Right, yeah.
Rather than just simply, I mean, it is top down in terms of the experience. You know, once you're conscious, I believe you can act top down back on your behavior. So fear has a purpose. Once you're afraid, you can use that knowledge of danger to consciously make decisions about what to do next. And, you know, in the end, I believe in free will. I can't prove it, and there are lots of debates about that.
Right.
But you know, I think it's worth considering the possibility that the consciousness does have a value. So, but in terms of how it happens, you know, I think the cognitive science gives us lots of important clues, because if we just simply take how we become conscious of a visual stimulus, we know that information about an apple, for example, goes to your retina, goes into your visual cortex. Your visual cortex begins to assemble some kind of representation, but it's also feeding forward into higher centers. It's going into memory, and memory is allowing you to kind of, begin to recognize what it is. It goes to prefrontal cortex, which is also getting the memory and the sensory information, and it's making predictions about what that thing is. And according to, for example, predictive coding hypothesis, the higher order areas are concluding what's there before the lower order areas have actually finished constructing. It's a more tedious thing down there, and the higher order stuff gets a few little samples of information and draws a conclusion. And from that, if it's wrong, then you correct the error and do another iteration through the circuit. But yeah, so in terms of a visual memory, a visual perception, you've got to have some memory that is going to define what it is that you're looking at, because we don't know what apples are without memory. So the one set of findings is that when you are conscious of a stimulus, in the sense that you can give a report of what it is you're seeing, then in addition to visual cortex, you need prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is kind of top down and pattern completing all that lower order stuff. And so one possibility then is that if that the prefrontal cognitive circuitry involving working memory and metacognition and all these complicated cognitive things that we do with our brain, maybe that is the answer. And what it does is our conscious experience of an apple, in that sense, is assembled in the exact same way as our conscious experience of fear. What's different is that in fear, in addition to the stimulus, you've got all these other inputs. The amygdala has been activated, the body is responding, hormones are being released, the brain is being aroused, triggering all kinds of complicated semantic and episodic memories. All kinds of stuff is happening that's not happening when you're just perceiving an apple. And that additional stuff is what makes that conscious experience of fear different from a simple, non-emotional cognitive consciousness.
Right.
So that's my kind of working hypothesis.
I wonder if that might be able to shed a light on this philosophical question that I've been wondering about, and that's the distinction between facts and values, whether we can observe facts as objectively as they can, or are we always inputting a layer of value on it for
Probably always.
Right? That would have to be the case, right?
Yeah.
And that would almost sort of bleed a radical subjectivity to everybody's perception, because his perception here or your perception here of the same microphone is different from my perception, because there's a different value associated to it.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some philosophical argument against that.
For sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
But yeah, that's
talk
what
about forever. Philosophers can talk for a lot of time. But what was also very interesting to me was the split brain patients and the way consciousness operates with them.
Yeah.
It's like consciousness is doing the part of stitching rationale to every action that the cognition is separated in, right? I wonder why Michael Gazzaniga suggested that consciousness is an instinct. Why an instinct?
Yeah, well, I mean, he's saying it's a human. I'm interpreting, but from reading the book and my interpretation of what he means is that it's a human trait, and it's innate in us now.
Right.
But it didn't necessarily. I don't think he necessarily thinks. Well, he might, but I would say it's an instinct that is an acceptation.
Consciousness is an acceptation.
Yeah. So,
and what was it previously used for?
Well, no, it didn't exist. It's based on acceptations.
It's based on acceptations.
Yeah, right.
I see.
So language and blah 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 and all these things. Consciousness was allowed by or human consciousness, I would say, was allowed by these other things that allow us to represent ourselves and autonoetic awareness and all, have that sense of self that I am part of the subject matter of this experience.
Right.
Now, that that doesn't mean that other animals don't have any kind of consciousness. So, what we can do to think about this is look at the cortex, the prefrontal cortex of humans, other primates, and other mammals. So just take those three groups. Now, there's a part of the human prefrontal cortex that no other primate has. It's called the lateral frontal pole. It's in the very front. And so not even other, like apes have a medial frontal pole as well, but not the lateral pole. And we share with other primates, though, a lateral prefrontal cortex, not the pole, but like dorsolateral and ventrolateral, which is where working memory and all that stuff is. So monkeys and apes have the same kind of cognitive working memory abilities that we do, or like what we have may be a little different because we have language, but the foundation of working memory is there in non-human primates. Now, other mammals don't have these lateral areas and only have medial areas of prefrontal cortex. So they may have their own kind of working memory. It's going to be different. It's not going to, obviously not going to be verbal. It's going to be more, I think, kind of body awareness based. It's going to be more about, their physical needs. We don't know. These are speculations. But the point is that because we can distinguish brain areas in these three groups, humans, non-human primates, and non-primate mammals, we can try to understand what those three areas do, those three groups of structures do in the human brain, and kind of reverse engineer back what could possibly be experienced in other organisms. So I'm not denying it. I'm just saying it's very hard to study the subjective part in another animal.
Absolutely, because I think we have, in the same anthropomorphic tone that we've been discussing, we have a hyper-visual reliance on stuff. Our consciousness is visual and verbal. For a lot of animals, it's olfactory, and we don't know what that could even. It's beyond our imaginative spectrum in some sense. I was also writing this very interesting paper one time, and I was like, I think even the scientific method is to some degree anthropomorphic because it places such a high value on empiricism. And what if it's beyond the psychological spectrum of things that I can perceive?
Interesting.
But
I just want to say one other thing. Though.
Yes.
So, we've been talking a lot about why we can't study animal consciousness and blah blah blah. But we also have to realize that it's there's a lot we can learn from animals, because all of the cognitive stuff is rats have certain kinds of mental capacities that we call mental modeling. Cognitive maps, making a map of the environment and running around in it and using mental trajectories to navigate and so forth. So, and then non-human primates have even greater capacities for working memory and holding information in mind while in the absence of a stimulus, and being able to guide behavior on the basis, looking like trying to figure out a route and projecting miles ahead as they're kind of foraging or trying to find a new home. So it's not a consolation prize to say that they have these tremendous cognitive capacities. I mean, that's the important thing. Consciousness is, it's useful and it's great for us, but it's not necessarily the world's greatest thing, because our consciousness is what's destroying the world right now. If we weren't conscious beings, like self-conscious beings that can be greedy and selfish and narcissistic, we would be a very different species, probably much less interesting, because it's all this greed and avarice and hatred that has driven the world. So if we were all just like happy and living together, I mean that sounds great in principle, but would we have the drive to build the Empire State Building?
No. It's very paradoxical.
I'm not making a value judgment about any of this.
Absolutely. I think that should be. That's absolutely the case. It's paradoxical in that sense, because consciousness is, as you say, is part of the reason why we are massively on a death drive, and part of the reason that can only save us from doing this death drive. You were talking about this process of reverse engineering from having a blueprint of different animals and their brains. A quote came up in my mind from Dalai Lama's book, the universe in a single atom. And he sort of says, the fact that consciousness emerges out of the brain is a metaphysical assumption and not a scientific fact. What do you have to say about that?
Well, you know, I'm a scientist, I'm a materialist.
Right.
So I firmly believe that whatever our brain is doing is material.
Right.
I mean, I guess he's saying it's not in the brain, but, you know, I think he probably has a different, here again, we're dealing with what does the word mean?
Right,
you know?
right.
So he means one thing about it when he says consciousness, but I'm talking about things that come out of the brain. So that may be the problem.
Isn't part of the mystery just that we have no definition of consciousness?
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to put it in terms of very specific processes and things like mental time travel and episodic and somatic memory, and so we got autonoetic consciousness, noetic consciousness, and anoetic consciousness. These are all terms from Endel Tolving, and I think they characterize what's different about human and non-human primates and primate and non-primate mammals.
Right. Have you heard of Herbert Terrace?
Oh yeah, I know
yes.
I know her.
I took a class with him too, and I was talking to him about consciousness because he has a class called Evolution of Consciousness that only focuses on language. He says, let's solve the primary puzzle before we move on to the grander puzzle. And he's like, we don't even have a definition of consciousness. If you do, you are entitled for a Nobel Prize. And I just started thinking about it in my casual schoolboyish way, and I was like. And then I was reading literature on flow states and altered states of consciousness. And the one factor that would change consistently throughout was our perception of time. With flow states, time sort of is, there's a state of timelessness with altered states, be that psychedelic experiences, all of that. And I was wondering if it's a good place to begin saying that consciousness is sort of the sense perception of time. Because what is the cognitive schema of time otherwise? The
Well, I'm not going to take a stand because I'm not sure. What to say about that?
Okay, now
it's an interesting idea, but I haven't thought about it. So I don't
right, no, I absolutely understand. I like to have a few of my ideas come across.
No, it's cool.
I wanted to talk about anxiety, and there was a particular article I was reading, and it started off with saying every generation has a claim to say that they are the ones suffering from anxiety disorder, but this generation truly, and it sort of was directly in sync with the Kierkegaard quote that you use, that anxiety is the consequence of the human ability to choose.
Right.
In that sense, I think it's fair that we take the claim for the most anxious generation ever. We are predicated on variety. Variety is the commodity that we're predicated on. My question is, what is the way out? What do you think should we be doing, given that this is only going to increase?
Yeah. Well, first let me say something about who has the claim to the greatest anxiety. I mean, of course, our time seems to be worse than any other time, right? It's just like we can't imagine that anyone else suffered the way we did. But if you think about the Middle Ages, it's pretty awful with people, living in disease and dying.
Oh yeah.
Wars, just
unpredictability at its peak in terms of
really no idea what's going on. Very little control of your life. The king, controlled everything you did, and you had nothing.
Right.
So, I don't know. I mean, I do think that we have unusual challenges in modern life. Like everything comes with a price, and the digital age has definitely, brought a price tag.
Right. Because I was talking to somebody about. How dopamine, how most of our chemicals are so accessible to us. I don't need to actually do something in the real world to get the biochemical feedback that I need in my head, right? It's just obviously present to me in my screen. And I think in our times especially, not for elevation purposes, not for religious purposes, but just to acquire the position of baseline again, meditation could really be a very solid antidote to anxiety. Because it's right.
I do a little work with meditation, and it's hard.
It's very hard.
I got to a point where I was able to do a little bit for a few minutes, and kind of hold it, and then I took it. Went on a trip. And it was very stressful. Just when you need it, but that's the hardest time to do it. When you need it.
Yes, and it's the best time to do it too. Every time I think meditation's not going to help me, and I do sit and meditate, it actually does help me. It's like this. It's like the sideways process that sort of happens. I'm never really sure. But that would be probably the area I would like to investigate if I ever get into the field, because it's just so fascinating to me.
Right. I think I could, if I were starting over, I could get interested in that. But
right. I mean, there's a bunch of applications that ironically, that you can download that'll help you a lot with that too, in case you ever look into it. There is Headspace and Waking Up are the two primary ones. I mean, I finally just had one more question, and that was again one of my ideas. I was going to float through you. Tell me what you think of it. When considering emotions, I've always seen emotions as bundles of complicated thoughts tied together, not unbundled. And the bundling is such that the signal from my body to my body is a very binary Darwinian signal: happy, sad. And when I can pull apart that bundle and I can see the thought code written out for it, that emotion sort of fades. Is that any sensible way of looking at emotions at all?
Go through it again, Ty.
So it's like a bundle of a lot of strands of thought, codes of thought that are tied together.
Thought.
Thought. Okay. And that's a signal from the body to the body.
From the body to the body.
But it's so complicated because...
What do you mean from the body to the body?
From, say, the unconscious to the conscious. Okay. From the cognitive to the conscious.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Not from
No.
spleen.
But so, and then when I start to pull apart the code and see for what it is, that emotion sort of, then it becomes purely, it acquires its position back in the thought domain instead of the emotion domain.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's... Emily Dickinson had a quote, how it goes about, the anxiety, the fear is worse when it's coming than when it actually gets there.
Right.
So it's like once you've faced it and come to, you've gotten it in your head and it just dissipates in a sense.
Right. You also had a notion that almost inevitably fear is followed by anxiety. When the snake crosses, threat detection, fear. How's that happening?
Well, so fear is, it's kind of a definitional thing. So fear is an emotion that is triggered by an immediately present source of harm.
Right.
And anxiety is a worry about something that hasn't happened.
That might happen.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And so you see the snake there, and so you're afraid of it.
Right.
But you then begin to worry, is it going to bite me? If it bites me, will I be able to get to a doctor? Will he have the antidote? And what's going to happen to my family if the snake bites me and I die?
Right. So what we usually call a block fear, it's threat detection fear and then anxiety, what it really is, definitionally speaking. Right. I see.
And, anxiety can morph back into fear because you can be afraid of things you imagine. So once you start to worry, you're now imagining actual dangers, but it's like a kind of mental fear, and based on it's a worry about what hasn't happened, but you can make it very real through your thought processes.
Okay, I think those are all the questions I wanted in this conversation. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yep.